This is the story of how American banks and corporations funneled billions of dollars into German industry during the 1920s and 1930s, financing the very companies that later armed Hitler's Wehrmacht. And here's what's going to shock you. Despite extensive documentation, despite government seizures, despite congressional investigations, not a single American executive ever faced criminal prosecution for these dealings. We're talking about household names here. JP Morgan, Chase Bank, Ford, General Motors, Standard Oil. And this isn't conspiracy theory territory, because everything you're about to hear comes from 8.5 million pages of documents declassified under the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, along with Trading with the Enemy Act seizure records and congressional testimony that's been sitting in the archives for decades. So how did Wall Street end up building Hitler's war machine? Let's follow the money. Everything starts in 1924, right after World War I, when Germany's economy was completely destroyed and they owed massive reparations to the Allied powers. On September 1st of that year, the Dawes Plan took effect, and that's when JP Morgan and Company led a consortium that floated a $200 million loan to Germany, with half that money raised through Wall Street bond issues that American investors couldn't get enough of. Georgetown University professor Carroll Quigley later called the Dawes Plan largely a JP Morgan production, and he wasn't exaggerating. Thomas Lamont, who ran Morgan as the de facto CEO, personally led the renegotiation of German reparations, while Owen Young, chairman of General Electric and another Morgan associate, chaired the entire committee. The scale of this gets wild when you look at the numbers. By 1929, Germany had pulled in 29 billion Reichsmarks in foreign loans, and about 70% of that money came from American bankers, with JP Morgan handling most of it. Then in 1930, the Young Plan kept the cash flowing with another $300 million loan at 5.5% interest. But the real story here is what else it created: the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. Remember that name because this institution ended up facilitating Nazi gold transfers throughout the entire war. 3 Wall Street houses handled 3/4 of these reparations loans: Dillon Red, Harris Forbes, and National City Company, according to the Kilgore Committee, which investigated this from 1943 to 1946. These loans created German cartels that together produced 95% of the explosives for the Nazi side in World War II. Union Banking Corporation opened its doors in 1924 at 39 Broadway in New York, and its whole purpose was serving as the American investment arm for Fritz Thyssen, who happened to be Hitler's earliest and largest individual financial backer. On the board sat Prescott Bush, the future US Senator and grandfather of President George W. Bush, alongside W. Averill Harriman, who later became ambassador to the Soviet Union. 2 years earlier in 1922, W. A. Harriman and Company had made a personal agreement with Fritz Thyssen to move funds between New York and German interests, and the Harriman organization kicked in about $400,000 to get the relationship started. But the bigger play came from Dillon Red and Company, which created the German Steel Trust in 1926 with $70 million in financing and made Fritz Thyssen the majority owner. This trust ended up producing about 40% of German steel and controlled 75% of Germany's ore reserves, which meant Thyssen suddenly controlled the raw materials for Germany's entire war machine. October 20th, 1942 changed everything. The US government seized the Union Banking Corporation's assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and the order made it clear: these shares are held for the benefit of members of the Thyssen family and is property of nationals of a designated enemy country. Over the next few weeks, 18 more Brown Brothers Harriman and UBC-related assets got seized, including the Hamburg American line, which turned out had been smuggling Nazi spies into the United States. When Union Banking Corporation finally got liquidated in 1951, the Bush and Harriman families walked away with about $1.5 million each in compensation for their seized interests. Between 1936 and 1941, Chase National Bank, which is now JP Morgan Chase, ran something called the Rook Wanderer Mark Scheme that helped the Nazi government raise over $20 million through selling special German marks to German Americans. Chase and other US banks pocketed over $1.2 million in commissions from this operation, with Chase alone taking home more than $500,000. A declassified Treasury Department report put it bluntly: Chase's Paris branch served as a banker for the Third Reich. And here's the part that makes your stomach turn. Because according to National Archives records that came out in 2004, these marks were financed from assets that came mainly from Jews who had fled Germany. Chase actually increased its business after Kristallnacht in November 1938, right when Jewish emigration hit its peak. October 1940 is when the FBI started investigating Chase's scheme, but here's why nobody went to jail. Chase's lead lawyer threatened to reveal FBI, Army, and Navy sources and methods in open court if prosecution moved forward, and that threat worked perfectly because the investigation got dropped. Chase Manhattan didn't publicly acknowledge its predecessor's dealings with Nazi Germany until February 2000, nearly 60 years after the fact. Sullivan and Cromwell sat at the absolute center of rebuilding Germany after World War I, representing IG Farben, the German chemical giant that later produced Zyklon B, along with Krupp, the arms manufacturer, and multiple German provincial governments. John Foster Dulles, the senior partner, personally arranged about $1 billion in loans to German states and companies during the 1920s, and after Hitler took power, Dulles made his Berlin legal staff sign Heil Hitler on all outgoing correspondence because German regulations required it. April 8, 1933 is when his brother Alan Dulles met Adolf Hitler in Berlin, and despite witnessing Nazi violence against Jews firsthand, he came back to America without animus toward Hitler. 6 years later, in March 1939, John Foster stood in front of the Economic Club of New York and said this: "Only hysteria entertains the idea that Germany, Italy, or Japan contemplates war upon us." He called Hitler one who, from humble beginnings and despite the handicap of alien nationality, had attained the unquestioned leadership of a great nation. Both brothers built illustrious careers after the war. John Foster became Secretary of State under Eisenhower from 1953 to 1959, while Allen ran the CIA from 1953 to 1961. During World War II, Allen Dulles worked as OSS Station Chief in Bern, and that's where he gave immunity from Nuremberg prosecution to SS General Karl Wolff, even though Wolff had documented war crimes including arranging slave labor and shuttling Jews to Treblinka. IG Farben Industry formed in 1926 and built extensive American connections through its American subsidiary, which had a board that read like a who's who of American finance: Edsel Ford, Walter Teagle, who ran Standard Oil as president, Charles Mitchell, who ran National City Bank, and Paul Warburg, one of the guys who founded the Federal Reserve. The relationship between Standard Oil and IG Farben proved particularly dangerous for the Allied war effort. Under a 1929 agreement, Standard Oil handed IG Farben somewhere between $30 and $35 million, sources vary on the exact number, and got the rights to technology that turned coal into synthetic fuel, which became absolutely critical for keeping the Luftwaffe in the air. 1938 rolled around and Standard Oil with its subsidiaries supplied 500 tons of tetraethyl lead to the Luftwaffe. The Kilgore Committee's conclusion hit hard. Standard Oil agreements with IG Farben seriously imperiled the war preparations of the United States. The committee found that Standard fully accomplished IG's purpose of preventing United States production by dissuading American rubber companies from undertaking independent research in developing synthetic rubber processes. Standard Oil ended up signing a consent decree, released 2,000 patents royalty-free, and paid a $50,000 fine, but no executives faced criminal prosecution. General Motors bought Adam Opel in 1929 for $33.3 million, and by 1938, about 6,000 Opel Blitz trucks, roughly 29% of production, went straight to the Wehrmacht, which had become Opel's biggest customer. Through 1944, Opel cranked out over 130,000 trucks and chassis for the German military. But here's what really mattered. Opel's facility assembled 50% of all propulsion systems for the Ju-88 bomber, which became the Luftwaffe's most important bomber by 1940, and 10% of jet engines for the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. After the war ended, GM collected about $33 million in war reparations for Allied bombing damage to its German facilities, which meant American taxpayers paid GM for damage done while destroying German military production that GM had built. Ford Motor Company kept 52% ownership of Ford Werke throughout the war, while the operation produced turbines for V-2 rockets and used forced labor from Buchenwald concentration camp. the US government handed Ford $1.1 million for bombing damage after the war. ITT had invested about $30 million in Germany by Pearl Harbor, and its CEO Sosthenes Bane became the first American businessman to meet with Hitler as Chancellor on August 3, 1933. Through its subsidiary, ITT owned 25 to 30% of Focke-Wulf, which built fighters that wreaked havoc on Allied convoys. 1967 comes around and ITT received $27 million from the US government for war damages, including $5 million specifically for Focke-Wulf plant damage that Allied bombers had inflicted while trying to stop German fighter production. That bank for international settlements, created under the Young Plan, kept operating throughout the entire war, even though it had American leadership and Nazi board members working side by side. Directors included convicted war criminals, Walter Funk, who ran the Reichsbank, Hermann Schmitz, who ran IG Farben, and Emil Pohl, the Reichsbank vice president who literally processed dental gold stripped from concentration camp victims. At the height of Nazi control, the Reichsbank and occupied countries held 67.4% of BIS voting stock, and Emil Pohl called the BIS the Reichsbank's only real foreign branch. March 1939 saw 23 tons of Czechoslovak gold transferred to the Reichsbank following the German annexation. During the war, the bank received 3.7 tons of gold from the Reichsbank that had been looted from Belgium and the Netherlands and remelted at the Prussian Mint, and reportedly $378 million in gold got sent to BIS by the Nazi government after Pearl Harbor, all of it derived from looted national banks and Holocaust victims' possessions. Delegates at Bretton Woods in 1944 adopted a resolution recommending liquidation of the Bank for International Settlements at the earliest possible moment, but that never happened because European central bankers lobbied against it. Despite all this documentation, the Trading with the Enemy Act seizures, the Senate investigations, the Treasury Department reports, not a single American banker or executive faced criminal prosecution for Nazi dealings. Charles Hyam researched this using Freedom of Information Act documents and wrote that the Roosevelt administration feared prosecution would have drastically affected public morale, caused widespread strikes, and perhaps provoked mutinies in the armed services. German IG Farben executives got tried at Nuremberg, and of 23 defendants, 13 were found guilty with sentences ranging from 18 months to 8 years, but all of them walked out early by 1951. One executive who got 7 years ended up on Bayer's board in 1955. Meanwhile, Prescott Bush won election as U.S. Senator from Connecticut in 1952, and The Guardian found no record of any U.S. press coverage of the Bush-Nazi connection during any political campaigns. More than $3 billion flowed to Germany under the Dawes and Young Plans alone. American companies kept factories running that produced Wehrmacht trucks, Luftwaffe planes, and V-2 rocket components, while the Bank for International Settlements operated with American leadership and processed looted gold at the same time. The steel, chemicals, trucks, and fuel that powered Hitler's armies came largely from enterprises financed by Wall Street. President Roosevelt said it himself in September 1944, "Defeat of the Nazi armies will have to be followed by the eradication of these weapons of economic warfare." That eradication never came. Millions paid the consequences while accountability landed on no one in America. The archives remain open and the judgment belongs to history.